Dismantling wokeness means dismantling disparate impact legal theory. It's tucked away inside Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or at least it was. President Trump has now signed a new executive order titled Restoring Equality of Opportunity and Meritocracy. It orders, in part, quote, the United States to eliminate the use of disparate impact in all contexts to the maximum degree possible, end quote. So what is disparate impact, and how did it empower leftists within the DOJ Civil Rights Division for so long? Here to answer those questions and more is Jeremy Carl, a senior fellow with the Claremont Institute. He is also the author of The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Great. So in order to understand just how big of a deal President Trump's executive order really is, reacquaint the audience with what disparate impact is, or at least was.
Sure. And I should sort of stress, I think this is actually arguably, if it's not the biggest executive order he's done in his administration, it's certainly in the top three. What disparate impact doctrine was something that grew out of the Civil Rights Act, although I think it is important to say that when they originally passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, legal scholars who have studied the act sort of say that basically what became disparate impact was pretty much ruled out during the floor debate. They said, no, we're absolutely not doing that. But what it eventually became was there was a Supreme Court case called Griggs versus Duke Power in 1971. And what that essentially did is there was a employment aptitude test, both involving what was essentially an IQ test and a mechanical aptitude test that Duke Power, a company, had given to its employees for promotion purposes, not the sole purpose, but part of it. And what had happened is white employees and black employees passed that test at very different rates. And there was a lawsuit that said that this was discriminatory, even though there was no actual intentional discrimination alleged by the plaintiffs, but the Supreme Court, kind of ignoring the plain kind of intent of these people who built the Civil Rights Act, said, in fact, yes, this is illegal discrimination, even though it wasn't intended, and therefore they basically said any employment process going forward that you had a sort of reference group that came in, and whoever you hired, if it differed too much from whatever your reference population that you would be hiring from was, that it could be said to have a disparate impact, and it was presumptively illegal. And the net result of all of that was it had a profound effect on anti-white and to some degree anti-Asian as well, discrimination in employment going forward. And so it's a huge, huge problem that was kind of lying under the surface. If you're not in the legal field, you may not even be aware of it. But believe me, it is giant, and removing it potentially is giant.
So this is something that you wrote about actually in your book, and you talk about how the DOJ Civil Rights Division for so long was able to weaponize this. I believe you call the DOJ Civil Rights Division politically liberal under Republicans, which is the best version, I guess, which is not so great. And then, of course, it swings to all the way radical when a Democrat is in office. So speak to that aspect as well for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. This was essentially used to do all sorts of mischief, and in many ways it was the proverbial dog that didn't bark, and that the people who tried to say, oh, well, this isn't a big deal, they would point to the fact that there weren't a million cases under this, although there were certainly plenty. But that's because there was an entire cottage industry of people who are kind of designing employment practices so they wouldn't run afoul of this law. And in fact, one of the members, and I talk about this in the book, of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, not even a Republican, wrote a law review article that was pretty influential, basically saying that the disparate impact doctrine essentially made any employment practice, presumptively illegal, and therefore you are kind of at the mercy of the DOJ, which is, of course, obviously what the people who want to empower the government would love, but was a very, very bad thing for the country.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this was one of those Trojan horses. It was one of those horses that wokeness was able to smuggle itself right into the mainstream, as we've seen really come to fruition in recent years. And thankfully, President Trump is now in office trying to dismantle that in so many ways. And I think what's important in your book, using that as a foundation here, as a touching stone, is that as it kind of swung back and forth in the court's disparate impact, is that as you talk about with the former president, the late president actually, George George H.W. Bush is that they knew how bad this was for the country, but they felt so much pressure. Whenever the term race or racism gets used, Republicans get scared, right? And so they do what they shouldn't do. So explain what pressures Bush was facing, and therefore, again, it just shows how great it is to see President Trump say, I don't care. You guys nearly got me thrown in prison last year with all the lawfare and everything else. I'm going to govern, basically.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely right. And I do talk about this in the book. So basically, this decision, Griggs versus Duke Power, was so radical, such a departure from any sort of practice that we'd had before, that even the very liberal Supreme Court at the time comes back 18 years later in a case called Ward's Cove v. Antonio, and they effectively gut the Griggs decision. So they basically say, instead of, I can't remember what it exactly was, but you had to previously have some really compelling business necessity to do it, and that's a very to kind of have these numbers that wouldn't balance out, and that's a very hard thing to prove. And it kind of changed the standard to like a business reason. And a business reason is something that's pretty easy to prove, and therefore it essentially would have gutted enforcement of this, and was a sort of implicit recognition of the court that they'd gotten it wrong in the original Griggs decision. But what happened is, of course, when that Ward's Cove decision came out, the civil rights groups freaked out. They started screaming racism. And George H.W. Bush, who was really a fairly liberal at heart, Northeastern patrician, this made him very uncomfortable. They wanted to get some sort of a Civil Rights Act that George H.W. Bush could sign. And so in the Civil Rights Act of 1991, basically because they were blackmailed by the civil rights group, the original definition under Griggs was restated and codified into U.S. law. And you can go read the kind of account of that from a senior Republican civil rights staffer at the time, a guy named Roger Clegg. And he wrote an entire article about kind of how all the professionals, we knew how bad, they knew how bad it was, but they were intimidated by the politics. And it just shows when you don't have good leadership, when you don't have strong leadership, as we did not under George H.W. Bush, you get railroaded like this with profound consequences. And conversely, when you do have strong leadership, as we have under President Trump, the dividends can be really profound.
It really can be. And one thing that we heard about a lot, at least in right-wing circles towards the end of Biden's term in office, was the competency crisis, right? We would talk about crumbling infrastructure. We would see parts of planes falling out of the sky. It's quite scary. And I think a lot of wokeness and this disparate impact, it helps to lower standards, right? Because I've seen fire departments, for example, they get sued because they'll have a test. It'll be very simple questions about time, right? It'll say, imagine that your shift ends at this time and you're asked to stay over 4 hours. So how much overtime did you work? Simple questions like that. And then based on the outcome of those results in which applicants are hired or not hired, they'll say, well, it's racist. And we're just talking about very simple math and timekeeping and the like. Do you think that factors into the competency crisis that hopefully we're trying to reverse now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge part of this competency crisis. And what's more, all the doctrines like this inherently show distrust and resentment based on race within the system. Because if you're kind of on the losing end of this, racial dynamic, you're going to be bitter. You're going to think that the reason why you didn't get X or Y is just because of race, even if, by the way, you wouldn't have gotten the position even under a racially neutral standard, which of course can happen. And similarly, it sows distrust, even if somebody from a favored race in these sorts of decisions is highly, highly qualified, right? Because you just never know, because you've got this huge thumb on the scale. And so I think it feeds into distrust. It feeds into the competency crisis. It's a grave, grave problem all around. And it's one of these things that Trump is going to fix to a degree now. I mean, I think to really get the permanent fix, we're going to need to have the Supreme Court rule this part of the 1991 Act unconstitutional. I actually think that this court is ready to do that. But in the meantime, this is a great fix that at least gives us space to move away from this type of racial bean counting that we have been suffering under now for almost a half a century.
Yeah, and it just leads into so many other related issues. I was just thinking to myself about public education and how we failed students for so many decades, right? Especially you read about reports in Baltimore, for example, or in some of these other major cities, and they'll say, well, schools in our district no one can read proficiently at grade level or do math at grade level. And then those students, it's not like they're all being held back forever and they're 30 years old sitting in a high school classroom. They're being graduated and they're going out into the world. And so in a lot of those predominantly minority areas, if you got your degree, your diploma, and your teachers have failed you the entire time, and you go out into the world and you try and get a job, but you're not actually able to have a good command of the English language or to do math at, what you should be able to do. But again, it's because your teachers have failed you for so long and said, no, you are good. Here's your diploma. You pass with flying colors. And then you don't get hired. You think, well, the only reason could be because my race, right? The white kid with the GED, how come he got hired and I didn't? We have the exact same degree. How come I'm not getting hired? And again, it just helps to feed into these racial animosities that should not exist. It's very misplaced, and we should be looking at the real root causes of that. And again, public education is just one of the many, many real issues that are underlying some of this. But Jeremy, before I let you go tonight, any last thoughts on this issue for the audience?
No, just I'm glad that I'm getting the opportunity to tell people, because it's one of these things that it seems kind of complicated and weird and legal, and therefore people might not think it's that important. No, this is hugely important. And if you look on X right now, it's not just people like me who kind of these types of issues are their bread and butter saying this is super important. You've got guys like Charlie Kirk or Jack Posobiec or other people who, have a bigger sort of look at the conservative movement saying, hey, wow, this may be Trump's biggest executive order yet, or right up there. And so it'll take time for the consequences of this executive order to fully play out. But it's such an important step that the president has taken, and I commend the president and his team for having done so.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's one of those Trojan horses for wokeness. For so long, Republicans, as you were talking about with Bush Sr., too afraid to really tackle it head on. And again, like you were saying, this will pay off huge with dividends, hopefully coming into the future. But Jeremy, thanks for making time for us.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
For all our viewers asking where One America News is heading in the future, we would like to introduce you to OAN Live. OAN Live is the best way to stay up to date on all of the hard-hitting, straight-shooting, national and international headlines. And the best part is, OAN Live is only $4.99 per month. All the credible, honest, unbiased reporting One America News offers at a fraction of the cost of cable. Just go to OANN.com to easily sign up for OAN Live and stay informed.